if GitHub had decided, let's write our own version control system, right? And it was like, if we had the taste that kind of went into the tools that we did and sort of, usability and going to first principles and thinking about what are we really trying to do with this set of tools, right? Like what would GitHub possibly have created?
Hello, welcome to the DevTools-fm podcast. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host, Justin.
Hey, everyone. Today, we're really excited to introduce Scott Chacon. So Scott is a co-founder of GitHub. You also co-founded Chatterbug, and now you are working on a product called Git Butler, which I am super excited about. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Before we start talking about the things that you've worked on, would you like to tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
That's a pretty good overview. The places that I've worked. I live in Berlin as well. So I used to live in the Bay Area, but so a lot of I have done a little bit of angel investing through a company called Scene, and so. But yeah, at the end of the day, I'm a startup guy. So I think I'm going to be working at startups until I kick the bucket at some point.
That's cool. Is Chatterbug still running? I wasn't sure what the exact status of that was.
Yeah, so Chatterbug, we kind of did the when you raise money in sort of a VC setting, you can either kind of go big or go home. It didn't really get to the point where we could raise another round, but I had personally invested a lot of money into it, and we had raised kind of too much for it to be able to exit really, and so we kind of spun it down. It was profitable, right? Like if there was almost nobody working at it, so we kind of spun it down. Like it's still running. It runs by it essentially just runs by itself and makes some profit, and so. One of the guys that used to work at Chatterbug sort of took it over and just runs it essentially by himself. So there's still tons and tons of people that are learning languages and using Chatterbug on a daily basis. But I decided that I should probably spend my time working on something else.
Nice, yeah. That makes me think of Muse, Adam Wiggins' most recent project. They had a similar sort of thing. It's just like realizing it's like, okay, to get the sort of like size of audience that we want, we're not really going to be able to reach that with this. So they did the same thing and like spun it down to like a small minimal. I think there's a solo person who's like sort of maintaining the project and moving it forward now.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. I just talked to Adam about that. He lives in Berlin as well. Like we kind of have similar journeys, and we just had a meeting the other day. He's coming out to the conference that we're putting on called The Merge in Berlin in a couple months, and so I'll be talking to him about some of that stuff too, which I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, Adam's great. Cool. So let's maybe dive right into it. GitHub has been obviously very tremendously influential and impactful on the development industry at large. I mean, it's hard to think about like pre-GitHub days and how gnarly just centralized source control, like having some place to go to download code was. But so how did the idea for GitHub start? And did you ever think it was going to be as big as it is today?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny now. I've been, now that I'm back in working on developer tools, I've been speaking at some conferences again about version control or sort of software development, and I'm realizing I've been I've been working in this language learning thing for 7 years now. Before that, like since I left GitHub, and now there's a whole generation of software developers who have never used anything other than Git and GitHub. Like they never used Subversion. They learned Git in college, right? And it's such a strange, like this just wasn't my mentality. Like when I first started, working on GitHub, I was going around trying to teach people, like trying to convince them you should use Git because it's better than Subversion, and here's why, right? Or better than Perforce, and here's why. And look at how cool branching is. And now, like it's almost the opposite of trying to be like, it doesn't have to be like this, right? Like there was a time when there were options and there were pluses and minuses. But yeah, I mean, essentially it started because Git was coming up. I mean, there was this whole era, I'm sure you guys probably remember this, where everybody was using Subversion in open source for the most part. or CVS, right? If you just didn't want to take the leap because it wasn't really a big enough difference for you. Or you're in a corporate environment, you'd be using Perforce, or you'd be using ClearCase, or whatever. And then this explosion of these cool distributed version control systems all came out kind of at the same time, right? There was like Bazaar and Mercurial and Darks and Git, and at the time, like, none of us really knew what was going to win. I think everybody was kind of trying them out if you were kind of on the edge, right? And you were like, let's see if this is a little bit cooler, right, or a little bit better for what I'm trying to do. And the open source, and in my world, the Ruby world, like, we all kind of moved to Git, but that wasn't true for everybody, right? Like some communities went down the Mercurial route or whatever, and there was a lot of kind of competition between these groups. And I found that so interesting. It was so much fun, right, to be in that world. But there was no good hosting solutions at the time, and so my friends Chris and PJ and Tom, like, we knew each other from Ruby meetups in San Francisco, and Tom and Chris started working on GitHub, and kind of, I knew Git really well. I had written a book on Git because I had learned it for something else I was doing, and so I like to document stuff and try to help the next person that comes behind me. That's just something fun for me to do, and so we kind of got together because I actually really knew Git very well, and they just liked Git a lot and kind of wanted to make a host that was better than some guy in Lithuania or whatever that had like repo.or.cz or whatever the only hosting solution was at the time. So yeah, that's kind of how it was, scratch your own itch type thing in the early days, and I love the idea of sort of working in developer tools, and so that's how it got started. And to answer your last question, very provably, none of us thought it would be a big deal. We even talked to VCs in the early days, and they were telling us, the total market cap of all of this type of developer tooling would be like $100 million, right? And I think we sold GitHub for $7 billion. Like, it was completely ridiculous, right? They clearly didn't. None of us knew what this could be. And we were all surprised by it. And most of my time at GitHub, I think, was taken up by us trying to handle steering a rocket ship that kind of took off much faster than any of us expected. And it was a hell of a time, but definitely not expected.
So in the early days, I thought that you wrote the Git book after you guys founded GitHub, but you wrote it before. So can you tell us about like why you did that and some of the fun things you learned along the way while writing it? Yeah,
so actually it's a little confusing. I wrote a book. I actually worked on the Git community book, which was kind of the documentation that was around the Git community at the time. I helped augment that. And then I wrote from scratch a peep code PDF. If you guys remember peep code, that you can still find online. It was open sourced after peep code was acquired. And then I started work on Apress. Approached me about the Pro Git book, and so the real sort of publisher that the Git that you would, or the Git book that you would read on gitsem.com right now, that's Creative Commons dual licensed, and so I started that after I started working at GitHub. I was there for about a year, probably, before I started that project. But yeah, so I've written a lot of stuff on Git. The before that was the peep code one though. So I have no end of interest in documenting and talking about Git, apparently. But yeah, to go back to your other question, like what you learn, right? I think anytime that you write a book, you learn mostly what you don't know, right? Like, I was pretty good at Git, and I knew Git really well, and I can describe the sort of object database and stuff like that. But there's tons of stuff that I didn't know, right? Like, I never really used submodules professionally, or I'd never done like subtree merging, or there was all this stuff that it could do, and I knew it could do it, and I knew theoretically that it was capable of doing it, and then I'd have to kind of I'd have to give myself, like a challenge, right? And see if I could solve it, and then see if I could document the solution to it, and then help somebody else. And I always felt very kind of crappy about those parts of the book, because it's like I've never really used, I try constantly now to talk to people that have different workflows and try to get an idea of, I kind of want to sit over their shoulder and be like, how do you use this, and what is frustrating about it, and what is good about it, right? Like we'll end up talking about Git Butler at some point, but that's a lot of what I'm trying to do with that as well, is be like, I know what my workflow is, like I know how I use these tools, and I know kind of some of the design stuff, but like, there's so much you don't know if you try to write a comprehensive book about something, about anything, and it's very humbling.
We'd like to thank this week's episode sponsor, Clerk. If you've been on Twitter by now, everybody knows you don't want to roll your own auth, and Clerk helps you do that with so many different cool options. Clerk provides full stack integrations for authentication that makes setting up authentication in your new app super easy. They support a whole host of different acronyms for authorization. They have MFA, SSO, Magic Links, SMS, so many different ways to log in, and you don't have to worry about it. One thing that a lot of people don't think about when they're setting up a company is doing all of these more enterprisey auth things. At the start of your business, you might not care. You'll just go with simple email and user password. But as you integrate more business to business, it becomes more and more important that you have these different types of authentication. And you don't want to hit those roadblocks and then be stumped for months. You want to be able to deliver on these mission critical features super easily. One of the selling points for front-end developers is Clerk offers a whole bunch of different pre-built UI components that you can use to just drop into your app and get going. They also offer components for user profiles and organizations. The best part about Clerk is they have an awesome free tier. They offer up to 10,000 monthly active users. They offer everything you need to authenticate and manage your users, freeing you to build the app that you want to, instead of having to deal with authentication. Would you like to not hear these ads anymore? Become a member on one of the many platforms we offer memberships on. With it, you'll get ad-free content, and you'll get it a little bit earlier than everybody else. And if you want to find another way to support the podcast, head over to shop.devtools.fm where you can grab some merch. And with that, let's get back to the episode. Yeah, our past sponsor, Code Crafters, has this course where you build your own Git from like scratch, and like so many different things that I built during that course just kind of blew my mind. The first being that Git started without being a version control system and was really kind of like this lower level set of utilities you were supposed to build your own version control system on. So like when I learned that, I was like, oh, I see Git Butler was just like the idea there was just like calling to be made.
Yeah. Actually, it's surprising that fewer version control systems have really done that, right? Like there's nothing that kind of has Git as the object database or the transport mechanism, right? Of just saying, here's how to get trees from A to B, which is, like you said, this is if you look at the first commit in Git, right? You can compile that C code and you can write stuff that's still generally readable by Git now. And the commands are a little obtuse, but it still does essentially what Git does, right? And there wasn't, essentially like the one guy, I forget what his name is, started writing some Perl scripts, to kind of automate some of this. And then that just kind of got turned into the porcelain stuff, right? But it hasn't really been modified that much since then. And more incredibly to me, nobody's come out with a GUI that doesn't just wrap all those commands, right? That comes up with some completely different way of doing it and just writes that database out, which is completely doable, right? Which is mostly what we're doing. It's easier now with us because we're using libgit 2, right? There's some libraries and stuff. You don't have to fork exec out everything, but yeah, I mean, it's all. Yeah, it's all a database and then tools on top of it, and you don't have to use those tools in order to use that database, right? But it hasn't really been done a lot since then.
It is really interesting how, obviously Git has won the sort of decentralized source control wars, and it brings a lot of like incredible power to the developer, and it's been a great tool, but it feels like of the tools in our tool chain that we rely on so much, it kind of shows, it's like there are definitely some warts that like people are more and more aware of. And especially if you have like younger engineers who this is, like, as you mentioned earlier, this is all they know. And they get into it and they're like, oh God, I messed up. What do I do? Like you teach them about like reflog or something, and there's a lot of overhead to just the workflow. And the UX that's there. I remember having conversations with some colleagues a little bit earlier in my career, and they were like really diehard on Mercurial because they thought that the just UX of Mercurial, like how you interacted with Mercurial was a better experience, like the kind of commands that you had. And even more recently, when I was at Oxide, there's people talking about there's this tool called JJ, which is another, exactly, jujitsu being.
If you're listening to this podcast and you're interested in version control tools, I would definitely say check out Jiu-Jitsu, because it's in my opinion the most interesting, other than Git Butler obviously, but it's the most interesting thing going on in, let's say, command line version control tools, right? Because they have kind of done this, right? They do have Git as this backend that they're writing objects into, and so it is compatible fully with. When you push it to GitHub, you can't tell that you're using something that's not Git, right? But they do. The user interface is much different. Just the whole approach to how they put patches together and how they do commits, right? Like you have to relearn stuff a little bit, but it's totally fascinating, right? Like you just say, I want a new workspace, and that essentially commits the last one, right? And there's no index. It's just your working directory is kind of what your next commit is going to look like. And it's a slightly different shift, but it changes the way that you approach your work in a very interesting manner, right? Where it's essentially a much better rebasing tool, right? Like rebasing is so powerful, but it's such a pain to use. And they've really been like, how can we get what is interesting about rebasing, but make it very, very easy to use, and really encourage that style of workflow. And actually, it's funny, just today, actually this week, I've been working a lot on trying to get a lot of those things into Git Butler and allow you to work in that manner, right? Like opening up a commit 5 commits back and taking a file or a hunk out of a file you committed there and dragging it 3 commits up and having it automatically rebase everything so that it looks like you're just kind of moving changes around your commits, right? And letting you kind of do this patch centric sort of workflow. But yeah, there's to answer, or to go back to your point, right? There are really interesting things that you can do in what we're all trying to do, which is really put together a group of changes that is either documented so that if you look at it later, you understand why those changes were done together, or reviewable, right? By whatever review system that you're using, and kind of combining them into commits can be a nice way of doing that. But yeah, Jiu-Jitsu is very exciting to me, and even the other one, like I just had beers with the guys who took over Mercurial development recently, and the guy, I forget what his name is, that does Pujol, which is sort of the Darks 2.0, theory of patches thing, and they're all passionate about version control tools, right? And there's a small set of us nerds, version control nerds, that to sit down and have beers and kind of argue over what style is better is really fascinating. But at the end of the day, developers just want to do their work and kind of have it be as easy as possible and be able to communicate that and transfer that as easily as possible. And none of the tools are really very focused on that. And I think it could be very different.
I want to move on to talk about Git Butler, but before we do, I have one question for you about GitHub and its legacy. So the pull request model is something that I contribute to GitHub. It's kind of changed how a lot of people think about contributing to a Git code base, specifically through GitHub. But there is this one thing that I've heard repeatedly about the sort of side effects of how pull requests work. So you create a pull request, or you have a branch, and then you create a pull request from that branch, and you've got a lot of code committed, and then people come in and review it. So it's like there's almost this encouraged to like review later in the process. And the other thing is, it's like, this is just a part of Git, and again, I think this is a tee off our conversation with Git Butler, but like pull requests tend to get larger over time, like bigger, because it's like harder to break those things down. I've heard a lot of people wishing there were things like stacked PRs, like you could do that easier. And I mean, I feel like a lot of this is, just derived from the primitives of the pull request, that legacy of like how GitHub introduced how we merge changes into a code base. So can you think about or can you talk about like how y'all were thinking about that originally, and how your thinking on it has maybe evolved over time, and like where we're landed out with that?
Yeah, I mean, originally, we were, in the early days, the pull request was just an email that said, here's how to run the git pull command locally so that you can fetch, a branch down and merge it into whatever branch that you're in. And so it'd just be an email that said, run this command line thing, and then that will pull this reference and merge it, and you can test it. And if you like it, you can push it back to yours, right? And so it didn't really have this interface, and it didn't have this sort of unified diff that the pull request interface has now, which I think is kind of part of what the problem set is of how people have changed. Because in the early days, pull request was really just an easier way of sending a series of patches, right? But you could still sort of rebase your stuff or sort of squash work together or something and kind of work on a series of patches. Like if you think about the mailing list, right, or how you would communicate over a mailing list, even with Git today, if you want to contribute to Git or to Linux kernel or something and use Git to do this, a lot of the early tools were developed to send series of patches over email. And so every commit message is the email body, right? And then it sort of has this diff that's associated with it that you can pull into an inbox, pull out of an inbox and apply and stuff. But like everybody's thinking about commits as you send it to the mailing list and it's just a thread of like 3 emails, right? And they're reviewed as commits, not as a unified diff of all of the commits in the branch, sort of squashed into squashed out. And so how GitHub evolved was trying to make that process easier and like more, because it's very hard to send patches over email. If you've ever tried to do it without fucking it up, it's incredibly difficult to do right if you're not just living out of inbox all the time, right? And so if you use Gmail and you want to contribute a patch to Git, like it's very hard to do properly without getting yelled at. And so we wanted to make that accessible because it was really we wanted to make Git usable for people and to collaborate and in open source and stuff. And so in making it easy, what we did was, make it so that if somebody gives you some review and you want to fix a bug, what's easiest is to fix the bug and then you do a new commit, because now you don't have to learn. Not everybody has to learn how to be a rebase master, right? Which you otherwise have to. You have to be very, very good at sort of all of that rebasing type, interactive rebasing and stopping and amending something and squashing and all that. And we wanted to not have that be a barrier, right? You could just use Git for everything that it's really good at, and for collaboration, who cares, right? Like just add the thing that fixes it. But it breaks blame and it breaks a lot of stuff, and it makes review really difficult because we didn't do review on a per commit basis, right? We're doing it on this unified diff basis. And so I think there's sort of pluses and minuses to that process. I think that there is space for some sort of review system that is more patch based. Like what stack diffs really try to do is bring back this concept of reviewing on a commit basis. And the way that they do it is by, throwing several branch pointers into a branch. So essentially every commit has its own branch, right? And then they're all kind of based on each other so that you can review them. But really, you just want to review kind of one commit at a time, or be good at have everybody be good at rebasing. So I think that there's something in between that. I think the future, like what would be really nice is some combination of these things, right? Where you can have something online, you can have a nice review process, it can be on a per commit basis. I think stack diffs is just a way of getting around what GitHub's interface is, rather than that's really how you want to review stuff, right? But at the end of the day, what you really want is, do you want the reviewer's job to be easier than your, like, if your tools are easy, you really want the reviewer's job to be easy, because you don't want them to come into some massive, unified diff. And there's issues with that as well. Like everything's in alphabetical order, right? Like if you want to test a file or if you want to review a file and then the test that file, and they're at complete opposite ends, right? Of the unified diff, it's really frustrating. Like you kind of want more of a story of here's what happened. And so, sending patches, having a nice patch series and sending to a mailing list kind of gives you that story in a more reviewable way, I think. But GitHub, it's difficult to do that way, right? So you have Graphite, or you have Fabricator, you have these tools that kind of help do both, right? Be in the GitHub world, but also do review in a way that's a little bit more approachable for larger sets, or for if you want a linear history or something. But yeah, I don't know if I've really answered your question rather than drone on a bit, but like I think there's still room in the world for a much, much better review system if we have tools that help make rebasing easier. Like if you're using Jiu-Jitsu and that is everybody's using that, or if you're using, hopefully Git Butler kind of makes that easier at some point, and you're more worried about what does my patch series look like, and you have review tools that are good at reviewing those types of, things that are rebased a lot. Like force pushing to GitHub branches is a pain for everybody, right? So you have to have something that kind of helps mitigate that. But if the tools make that easy, and if the review sort of has, I think splitting up review into commits or being able to tell more of a story with your history would be a much better way of collaborating.
Yeah, I am so surprised that anything got done back in the email patch days. I've very much grown up in the Git basically only. Like I used a little bit of Perforce when I was an intern, but like doing that over email just seems like an impossible task to me.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to look at that. Like, I've been trying to kind of learn, like I said, what people's workflows are, and it's a really interesting workflow, right? It's very different than sort of the GitHub workflow. And it has pluses and minuses, but like some of the, it's interesting to see, V10 of a series or something, right? Where you can see the previous versions and the previous comments and what was addressed and sort of it gives you this nice story. And it's, again, this one sort of email per commit. So you can just look at the ones that you're interested in if you want. I'm the front end of it. I'm just going to look at the front end commit or whatever, right? And it's specifically documented. And you can kind of inline comment in the patch, right? Like it has power that you lose with using GitHub PRs. And again, it's much harder to use, right? So you have to have this high bar for everyone to come in on it, which is not necessarily a good thing either, right? So, but yeah, some middle ground I think would be interesting in the future.
So now that we've talked about all things Git and version control, you have a new app, a new thing built on top of Git called Git Butler. So could you explain to us what Git Butler is and how it makes the Git workflow better?
Yeah. So when I left Chatterbug and we were thinking about what to do, I really kind of got into this version control. Quite obviously, I have a lot of opinions on it. I'm very interested in it. My background is all sort of in Git and GitHub. And I thought it would be interesting to try to, like, if GitHub had decided, let's write our own version control system, right? And it was like, if we had the taste that kind of went into the tools that we did and sort of, usability and going to first principles and thinking about what are we really trying to do with this set of tools, right? Like what would GitHub possibly have created? Like what would a client that because GitHub's always kind of pushed that off to the open source community and said, and then, they contribute to it, and Microsoft contributes to it a lot today, but not really in a user interface way, right? There's no tearing it down and saying, let's pretend like we owned this whole sphere, right? And what could be possible there? And I found that question really, really interesting, of just challenging myself of what preconceptions do I have about version control that are based on Git because I've been using it for 15 years now, right? And I hardly remember how to use anything else. So it was kind of a fun mental exercise. And so we started this company and started building tools and went off in one complete direction that we've essentially totally abandoned and found something that sticks a lot. I was trying to do the first, sorry if I go off on a little thing here, but the first thing that we were going around was I wanted a version control system that doesn't lose my work, right? Like you can lose your work in Git, you can mess up stuff but I was trying to think of other systems that do version control types of things, right? And I thought a lot about Google Docs and how Google Docs does version control, but in a massively different way than Git does. And started thinking about like what are the advantages and disadvantages of that, right? You can't fork it and go in a different direction, and there's no forking, but on the other hand, there's no merging and there's no losing work and there's no committing, right? Like it just constantly is looking at what you're doing and it's saving versions, and you can always go back to stuff. So there's interesting aspects of that, and I thought it would be nice if Git just had some, daemon in the background that was saving CRDTs of your work all the time, so you never lose anything, right? And just synchronizing it to the cloud somewhere, so you can just move over to another computer and turn on the client, and you get your working directory that you had over there, right? Like you don't have to commit in order to push something over the wire. And I found that really, and we built that out, and we built a little timeline where you can go back and see what, and we found it just wasn't very useful, right? Like, like it's useful if you lose work, but you lose work, like once a month, right? And it really sucks, but we wanted something that was more daily practical. And so we started looking at branches and tearing that down and being like, what do we really use branches for? And so right now, what mostly Git Butler does is branch management. And because we came up with this idea of virtual branches of saying, if I'm working on something and I see a bug, like right now in Git can only have one context at a time. And so you have to, everybody's done this a million times, right? Like you're working on some feature and you're really deep into it and you see something you want to fix, like documentation or a bug or something small. And you're like, I can either stash everything I have, right? Or do a work in progress commit or whatever, start a new branch, fix the thing, push it up, try to get it integrated, cherry pick it in, whatever, right? Like it becomes kind of this issue and it's annoying all the time. And so what most people do is they'll just fix it in that branch, right? And be like, it'll probably get integrated when this branch I'm sure it's fine, right? Like, even though it's orthogonal, you put it in one context because it's easy. You have to essentially be in one context at a time. And I was trying to figure out why that was, right? There's no particular reason. It's only because of the design of the index and the head, right? That Git can only really be on one branch at a time. There's no reason that you couldn't say for every entry in the index, say this goes to branch A and this goes to branch B, right? Or whatever. And so that's essentially what we do is we run a Git diff between sort of this upstream version, so origin master, origin main, or whatever you want to eventually integrate into. And then it diffs your working directory and says, here's all the hunks that I see that are different. Here's everything I see that's not integrated. So by definition, this is a branch, right? You don't have to create it and you don't have to name it. It's kind of like anonymous branching. Gives you a context, and then if you want a hunk to be in another branch, you just sort of drag it in the GUI over into another lane, and it says, okay, that's a branch. And then when you commit it, it just essentially takes, the base that you have and applies all the patches that are bookmarked for that, and creates a tree and creates a commit and pushes it off to GitHub and just kind of keeps them separate, right? So you can keep committing and working in multiple contexts at the same time, and we just sort of the smart index kind of keeps them all in memory separated and tries to remember what goes where, so that the next commit, it writes a tree out as though that was the only thing there, right? So that when you review it and when you merge it, and the nice thing is you're kind of doing it the opposite. You're starting with a working direct. Let's say you do a whole bunch of work, and then you take them and you take all your work and you drag it into 3 different branches and commit them and push them. The nice thing is that they all merge cleanly because you essentially started out with a merge product and then you extracted them into separate branches, right? So once they're all merged, the tree is going to look like whatever the working directory you started with when you extracted. And so that's kind of nice, right? Because and you can take in other people's remote branches and sort of apply them as virtual branches that sit alongside the work you're doing and say, okay, these things, this is what would happen if Git actually does, like if you look at Git maintenance or something, like Junio will do this, or Linux kernel, they'll merge in like 10 branches into one big octopus merge, right? And then try out everything and then unroll it again, right? Because they want to see if they all kind of work together. But it's too much of a pain for most people to do. And so most people don't do that, even though Git is fine with that, right? But not everybody wants to roll back stuff or have these merge products that are all over their code base or whatever. So people tend not to do it, but it's totally doable. And so, yeah, so we made this GUI. I thought it'd be nice to start with a GUI and try to figure out, is there a way of making a drag and drop type thing that can be a very powerful tool for managing information. But every GUI that's been built on Git just does stuff that Git does and just kind of fork execs out stuff. And so usually it's faster to just write it on the command line if you know what to do, right? And so we wanted to be like, is there ways of, like, you can't have multiple branches in Git, so like simultaneously applied. And so we were like, let's do a GUI and you can just drag a hunk over, right? I don't have to list them out and do a number and say, move it to this branch or whatever. You just drag stuff. And so yeah, we started building that in Tori. So now I'm a Rust developer, which is, I should never be led anywhere near a systems language, but I do a lot of Rust work now. But it's been super, super interesting to build out just sort of this vision of how would I want, branches to work. And it is quite complex, right? In how we're actually building these trees and applying patches and figuring out commutation, all this stuff. But, we need to make it look very easy. And so it's a really fun challenge. And GitHub was very much the same, right? Like, I think everything, strive for simplicity and make it as easy as possible to do what you want to do. In the background, it can be incredibly complicated. And I find those really, really fun projects.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's a lot to unpack there. To go back to where you started, sort of like the first thing you explored, I do want to give a shout out to the Ink and Switch team, Adam Wiggins and co. They're working on this project called Patchwork, which is like a universal source control for everything. They're kind of just trying to figure out, like, what are universal source control patterns? Like, if you're just like trying to integrate source control type workflows into your app. Like, how would you do that? And they have a really interesting research paper that they're working on for that. I'll link that in the show notes. This idea of virtual branches, though, when I first saw Git Butler, I seen this idea of virtual branches, and it clicked with me immediately, because I actually, like, branches are kind of my bane in Git. Because the thing is, I am doing work and I don't care what branch I'm in when I'm doing the work. I really don't care. I don't want to think about it. Like, I'm doing things and I know that, like, I need certain things to be in certain PRs. And the big problem is, and I've had this over my career, is for me to give the kind of experience that I need a reviewer to have, I have to do a lot of work ongoing throughout my workflow to be very rigorous about what things I put. And I make, like, very gratuitous uses of stashes. I stash everything all the time, and it's not great. I don't like it. I don't enjoy it. Most of the time, it's just like, it's a frustrating experience, but I do it to try to give the best experience for developers or for people reviewing. And even still, I end up with PRs with, like, too many associated changes and, like, too much stuff. So when I saw Git Butler and, like, what you're doing, I was like, I get it immediately. I was like, yes, this is exactly the thing I want. I was like, I'm just working. I've got a list of changes. Let me, like, put these into different branches and then push them up and do different PRs. So I think it's a fantastic idea. What are some of the challenges that you've had in integrating these virtual branches so far? Like, what is the big, like, struggles you had with it?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is we we've had, I don't know, 15,000 people sign up, so maybe 25,000 people download and try it out at some point. And that means that there's, like, 25,000 different repository sizes and workflows and edge cases of Git and things like that, there's a lot of privacy involved. We don't want to have access to any of your data that we don't need. And so we're kind of flying blind a lot of times when people are like, it's slow. And it's like, well, there's 1,000 reasons. There's so many reasons that could be, right? Can you tell me a little bit more about your code base? Are there large files? Are they untracked? What's the index size? Like, how many files do you have total? Like, do you have a sparse checkout? Do you have, do you have submodules? Do you have some, there's so many different, is it on Windows or Linux or Mac? Like, what file system, like it can be any of these things that could be slow stats, or could be, whatever. Windows specifically is a pain in the ass, but and it's in Rust, right? Like, all the back end stuff is in Rust. And so, we're trying to figure out, like, is our file system watcher running out of inodes, or, there's just so many things. When it was just us, it was very stable. Like, we were all dogfooding it, but we all have the same workflow and we all have the same code base, right? And so I think that's always the hard part, right? Is trying to make sure that it runs for everybody, that it runs fast for everybody. Like, Git is fast, and Git has been around forever, and Git is incredibly stable. And so, and Git has lots of little things that they've tried over time, right? Or their Git notes, or their, replacements or something. Like, there's so many of these things. And it does a GPG sign, right, when you commit, or, there's just all of these different configuration options and stuff that people kind of expect us to honor. And it's very hard to do all of those out of the gate. So all of edge cases are the problem, right? And we've been working for months since we got some attention, and a lot of people really started using it, of trying to fix all of it. We've essentially done very little feature work in a long time that isn't related to debugging. God, man, the number of ways that a Git client can authenticate with a server is endless. Like, this SSH and HTTP and tokens and auth headers, and oh my God, yeah, it's just all the different ways you can you can unlock an SSH key, like, thumb drives, or like, yeah. Anyways, so yeah, it's been super fun. But you start with this thing and you're like, you get it to work and you're so excited, but then scaling it is always the rub.
Yeah, for sure.
So virtual branches seem to be, like, the main feature that you guys have tackled so far, but your docs mentions one other feature, the timeline. So what is the timeline, and how would I use it in my project?
Yeah, so that was the thing I was talking about before, where we started out with this thing that was a file system watcher, and every time it sees an inode change, right, like it would see what that file looked like now, it'd create a CRDT, it'd store that, and so we'd have sort of, and then every half an hour, it'd sort of flush a sort of a keyframe of what the project looked like. So you could technically go back to any time anything was flushed to disk, and we could recreate anything since you started watching the project. And the project still does that, actually. If you want to, you can kind of go into our docs and find out where the data is, and you can go through and you can find there's documentation on how to recreate any of those files. But we don't show it in the interface anymore because we felt it was a little bit distracting, and we wanted to focus on getting this thing right, and we were going to bring it back. I think the way that's going to come back is more of an undo log. So that's kind of one of the things that we're working on right now, is just every time you do any major thing, drag a hunk to another lane or do a commit, or pull in a branch or unapply a branch or whatever, that we just kind of build up a history, an undo log, and you can look at it and just go back to this point, right? And it just puts everything back, which is really nice, because then you can mess around with stuff, right? And it's kind of hard to lose anything. Feel a little bit more confident. So yeah, we'll bring that back relatively soon, but I think it's going to come back not as this very complicated timeline that we found we weren't even using very much, but more as a, I want to undo the commit that I just did, right? And just have a control Z or whatever, which is hard to, it's actually one of the things that people Google a lot for in Git, is how do I undo this thing that I did, right? And so just having this very explicit, I can just go back to what everything looked like 10 minutes ago and hit the thing, and it's all back, right? And that just goes onto the top of the stack so that you can undo that if you want to, right? Like, I find that very interesting, and it's kind of interesting that that's also a rare feature in version control systems, is version controlling the version control, right? So I think that's how that's going to look. The other thing that we've been working on, like I said, is this more jujitsu type thing. So I think we make it relatively easy to do orthogonal work, in like parallel work, but dependent work is still very Git-like, right? Like you can undo the last commit with a button, but can you undo the third commit back, right? And sort of end up rebasing the rest? Or can you insert a blank commit and then drag some stuff into that, but it's 3 commits down or something like that? So I'm working on that. Like, I think horizontal and vertical sort of management of work, right? Like, there's work that is dependent on each other that you want to be able to manipulate your sort of commit stack and your patches, like do patch manipulation. And then there's orthogonal work where this is just not related, right? It doesn't matter what order these branches are merged in, and it shouldn't matter what order that they're merged in, that I know they all work together, and the review process can go in any order, and it doesn't matter when it's integrated. I'll just kind of keep it in here until I see it upstream, and then it just disappears from my board, right? But I think that's a lot of the thing, like you were talking about, like you don't want to worry about, like, I want to take out stuff you don't want to worry about. Like, I don't want to have to name a branch when I create the branch, right? Yeah. I like this mercurial idea of anonymous branches, of just being like, I'm just going to work on a different context, and then I'll name it when I name it, when I know what to name it, right? Or I'll write my commit message over time. I can start with a blank commit and write the commit message, and then write the code, and then like append it, like squash it into the commit. Like, that would be a nice way of doing it. Like, I don't have to wait until this very specific moment when I want to codify my work, and now I need my whole commit message, right? I find that's a nice thing about jujitsu, is that you can kind of amend it over time and work on it as a document almost as you're working on the code. And I think that's a much, much more interesting way of working than what we've kind of all been putting up with for a decade, right?
I want to talk about like team workflows a little bit. So, I mean, source control is one of these things, like pretty much like any other developer tool, where people have a lot of opinions, and some people feel very strongly about their opinions. This is like Vim versus Emacs kind of like flame wars. There are definitely going to be people on teams that are not going to want to adopt your tool. Like, even if you get like a lot of people on that team are like, yeah, we like to use Git Butler, we're all using it. And there are going to be some people like, no, I will not. You will pry the Git CLI from my cold dead hands. How do you ensure that like teams can continue to work together? Like, does it still integrate with GitHub? Like, how does the overall team workflow happens when like some people use it and some people don't?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's one of the first things that I did. One of my co-founder, Kirill, he started a version control system from scratch, right? And I think the reason that didn't work is this problem. And actually GitHub had this problem too, of this sort of greenfield problem. You need the whole company to move off of Perforce and move on to Git, right? And it was constantly like all of I'd go into companies and do Git training and stuff, and it'd always be some small team, some greenfield, and then it kind of spread within the company, right? But it has to go team by team. The whole team needs to use it. And that's a horrible way of trying to get to break into a market, right? So we designed this from the outset to be like, it doesn't matter, right? You can be the only one on the team using it, and it's writing the same commits that anybody else is. Nobody can tell that this is what you're doing. You push it to GitHub, you can't tell the difference, right? Like it's using libgit 2, it's writing commits exactly the same way anything else does. And so I think that's very important. What becomes interesting is when we want to get into more team-based workflows, right? Start reinventing some of the review stuff, or having our own hosted review stuff that's sort of pre GitHub, right? Or something like that. Be able to review work before you've committed it, right? Or before you've pushed it, right? Like I think that pre-commit review would be really a valuable thing to be able to do. But like some of the things that really are interesting to me that are completely unsolved are things like merge conflicts, right? Like people have, it's not common, right? Like, I mean, it's common, but it's not, what do you get merge conflicts once a week, once a month, like once a day, maybe, like if you're really on a busy team that's hitting the same files a lot. And a lot of times they're simple. Sometimes they're, if you're working on if you merge a lot, then they tend to be less. If you're working on a feature branch for a month, right, then you're going to conflict all over the place. But what's interesting about merge conflicts is in a team dynamic, like in centralized version control systems, you don't really have them, right? Because things lock. But in decentralized version control systems, that's one of the disadvantages. But you have the advantage of just being able to have this nice, clean context. But when you do, it's so interesting to me because there's no communication, right? They're very decentralized. Like even on GitHub, the branches don't know about each other. The PRs don't know about each other. Like you could kind of test them all and say this branch actually, wants to merge at some point and this branch wants to merge, but they conflict with each other. So this is going to be a race condition now, right? Like whichever one, and the weird part is whichever one hits the merge button first wins, right? Like 100%, they have 0% of the work. And the second person to hit that button has 100% of the integration work. There's no way of solving that. And so one of the things I really want to tackle at some point is having this, if you're using Git Butler, that the clients can communicate with each other, right? And start saying, hey, this branch you're working on, this doesn't merge cleanly with this other person's work in progress. Neither of you have committed anything, but I can see already that you're working on the same file, right? And you should probably start talking about that now rather than 3 days from now when it's going to be a problem for one of you, right? Whichever one's slowest. And so there are interesting things of taking some centralized concepts and trying to be like, what was nicer about this in some way? And can we kind of backport this into decentralized version control systems by helping them communicate a little bit, right? Or even being able to work on conflicts, in a team manner. Like it'd be kind of nice for us both to see the conflicts as they're evolving and maybe comment on them and maybe say, how should we approach this, right? And have some chat about it or something like that. Like that's actually very difficult to do, especially if it's pre-commit, right? So, but even if it's committed, like you have to pull it down and do the merge and see the thing and then kind of reference it in Slack or whatever. Like how do you even talk about merge conflicts with somebody, right? So there's tons of stuff like that I think that there's a lot of room for improvement in how we work together on source code and just really hasn't been addressed a lot.
So we live in an age of AI. Do you think AI will help with merge conflicts in the future? I see that you've been sprinkling like AI throughout the product.
Yeah, I mean, AI is so interesting, right? Like I'm curious what you guys find AI useful for. I find it useful for a lot of stuff, like but very specific things. Like I have a hard time imagining in the near future that I'm going to have a pull request description and then some AI is going to solve it for me, right? And be like, here's the changes to the 10 files that need to be changed in order for this to work the way that you want it to. Maybe, but like I haven't seen anything close to that, right? Like I have a hard time getting it to write a section of a function like really the way that I want it to, right? But working in Rust for the first time, it's actually super helpful of being able to write a comment and be like, I have this, sort of hash map and I need to turn it into like a vector of strings that are formatted in a specific way. Like, I know there's fold and map and shit in here somewhere, but like, and then, AI will kind of come in and be like this. And it's like, yeah, pretty close. Right. And you just kind of see what the compile errors are and fix one or two things. But I find it useful for almost a replacement of documentation in lots of cases. And so, we're using it for that. If you don't, because this happens a lot, right? You don't, as part of it is because you have to write your commit message at the end, but a lot of people don't like writing useful commit messages, right? Descriptive commit messages. And so you're like, fix some stuff and you commit it and you push it because you need to commit it in order to push it, right? And GitHub sort of squashes a lot of commits down into one unified diff. So nobody really reads the commit messages for the most part on GitHub workflow anyways. And so you don't really run into them until you blame something. So what we added was just a button that says, write my commit message for me, right? And it just sends all the diffs out and it comes back and they're fantastic. If you're not trying to explain why you did something and you're just trying to say, here's a one-liner, what happened in this patch, it's very good, right? It can be incredibly descriptive in a good way. And we also use it for writing branch names. You do an anonymous branch and then you work for a while and we see enough work and you can set on a toggle and we'll send it out to OpenAI and come back with a 5-word name or whatever. It's like, this is what this branch is doing, right? And you can rename it, but like, it's kind of nice to just have the system kind of automatically being like, this is clearly what you're working on, right? Like this is, if you want to stash this branch, like here's how to find it again. There's a description for it. So, we're sprinkling it in. To answer your original question, I think that AI tooling could be incredibly useful for certain types of merge conflicts. You can use them right now I've been doing some experiments with this of just sending merge conflicts to OpenAI or to Anthropic or whatever and saying, how would you solve this, right? And it can do it sometimes. Some types of like, especially, you add one class into Tailwind, descript, like it's in the middle of the thing or whatever. And you're like, where even is this? Like you have to go into Word diff or whatever to see what happened here and there. AI tools or LLMs are quite good at being like, this is clearly what happened and how to merge it together. What I'm kind of interested in is something like GitHub's data set where, they have, if you look at Git, any merge conflict that's ever happened in any project in the history of Git, you can recreate, right? Because the parents have the original parents and you can run it through the same algorithm that would have originally run through and said, this is almost certainly what the merge conflict looked like. And you have the resolution in the merge parent, right? Or in the merge object itself. And so like there's a database of hundreds of millions of merge conflicts and what the resolutions are in every possible language, right? That are all open source. And so I think training something specifically like a small model to do just that could be incredibly powerful, right? It could be a very, very good sort of specific model, not instead of a general model, but I haven't, I don't really have the resources to do that yet. But I definitely see a future where there is a lot more help with merge conflicts, or at least giving you the starting point of kind of, what happened and where you might want to look, right? I think for really big, gnarly merges, it might be difficult, but certainly for small stuff, can take that off your plate.
Yeah, I'm generally skeptical of AI for merge conflicts. And one of the big reasons why I say that is that there's been a lot of merge conflicts that I've had to do that I haven't had enough context as a person to resolve those. And I've had to get other people involved, specifically the other person working on the other side of this, and like talk about intent and talk through is like, okay, what of this do we want to keep? We both changed something in a similar direction and now we have decisions to make. And it's not like, oh, we just accept this and it's fine. It's like, no, actually there's more work to do. And we've got to reconcile and do other stuff. We had Maggie Appleton on the podcast recently, and she's like, she's sort of takes a stance generally against generative AI unless it's for like summarization. And I think like the summarization use case, especially of Git Butler, I think is like actually really good. I did appreciate the like auto names of branches and auto commit generation, because like for a lot of people, it's just the seed of like, okay, what do I even write in this like empty text box? And if you just give them something, that's usually enough to like inspire them to like add more. So I think that's good. The other thing that I think is really interesting here is translating intent into action when maybe you don't know exactly how to do the thing that you want to do. And you know, I think this is especially true of like UIs that require very specific interactions to accomplish a task. I was doing some product research and using Retool to try to build things, and I was like, oh, how do I do this thing that I know how to do in their UI? And you know, sometimes it's just like, if you just had like a text box, was like, look, this is the thing I want to do, like, do it for me, like, show me how to, you know, do this.
Yeah, I've actually, by far the most valuable thing that I've used AI for probably recently is in Hex. It's like a data, Hex.tech, I think, is this like Jupyter Notebook type deal. And it writes Python, you know, pandas code for me, right? Because I never remember, I don't do it enough to really remember, like off the top of my head, like how do I manipulate this pandas, you know, data frame into sort of the thing, and then turn it into a graph that I want to use. But I know how to explain that, right? And so I can be like, I'm trying to take this data frame and turn it into this, like, you know, change this field to filter it into this, whatever. And it's like, no problem, and it works, right? Like 100%, like almost 100% of the time, it is mind-blowing how much time I've saved trying to go through pandas documentation and figure out how to do something specific, right? Or find some examples, or write some SQL for me sometimes. So I'm relatively good at SQL. I'm old enough that I actually had to write a lot of stuff directly in SQL and not Arrow or whatever, in my early days. And so I can do a lot of SQL stuff. But even then, there's some difficult things to kind of wrap your head around. And if you tell it, okay, I want a cohort table, like cohort stuff is a little bit difficult to do sometimes, you know, given anyways, but like, it'll help you write all that stuff. So that type of thing, I think, you know, we've been thinking about it for things like absorb classification. So, you know, if you have 3 or 4 commits, and then you go in and you edit, you fix things that came up in review across 10 files or something. It's kind of nice. It would be really nice to hit a button that says, figure out what file or which of these commits each changed hunk should theoretically go into, right? So that I don't have to be like, okay, this goes here and this goes here, right? AI is probably pretty good at that, of being like, this is similar to these files, or this is historically committed with these 2 files, or historically have changes together, or they're similar. You know, it's obviously a test for this thing, right? And can kind of stick it where based on the commit message and based on the file contents and the changes, say this most likely is classified to go into this commit, right? So there's that type of, but all of it is, it's all, you know, most of the stuff that we're thinking of is saving you a couple of minutes at a time. It's not, you know, it's not saving you hours at a time or something, but it's reducing friction, you know, in a way that you don't want to, you know, you want to work on the code. You don't want to work on whatever you don't want to work on. Right?
I do think that there's this interesting idea that there's like a new paradigm of API where, you know, we build GUI products to, you know, give a very specific type of workflow to the user and to sort of direct them and guide them into doing specific actions that we translate down into, you know, machine operations that are like more complex or prepackaged or something. And, you know, a lot of times we'll like give an API to our product. So it's like, oh, well, you can't necessarily do this in your UI. We just haven't prioritized, or it's like not there yet. But like, we have these APIs, you know, you use a REST API, you can do this thing. There's a lot of non-technical people, or like not technical enough, or don't have enough time, or don't care enough to do the thing. But there's this interesting idea of like having this internal API that's there that an LLM can just like integrate and use. And it's like, oh, well, you want to do this thing? Yeah, I can do this thing for you. And it's like internally do this stuff without them having to like make a bunch of API calls or whatever. I think this is like interesting use case for the future of like AI integration into our products.
Yeah, there's you know, in the version control world, the other interesting thing that we've been looking at and trying to figure out, you know, what do we, if we had to go from first principles on a tool set, a lot of the archaeology tools in Git, I think haven't been, you know, it would be interesting to rethink them, right? And I think AP or AI can possibly play a big part in that. Like, you know, explain this function to me, right? Or something like that, right? Where it could go through all of the commits that modified that, like when it was moved from this file to this file, when it was restructured, take out white space changes. Like, you know, you can do git blame dash, you know, capital C 3 times dash L range, whatever, like if you know how to do all that, and then you get the last one, and then, but like walking back through, okay, tell me the story about, or, you know, even having access to Slack conversations or, you know, engineering or GitHub issues or whatever. Like, what's all the context around this? Tell me, what is the story of this function, right? So because I want to edit it and I don't know why it doesn't work the way that we want, or I don't want to not break something, right? Like, was there Sentry stuff involved in the last time this was, edited or whatever? I don't know. It's interesting to think about what we use some of our version control tools to answer, and if they're actually good at answering those questions, or if they're the only tool we have to answer those questions, and so we're fine with whatever we're given, right? But I think AI could be really good at that, of being able to do these more free-form questions about your code, or about the history, or about what you're trying to do, or about who to talk to about something, right? And so I'm excited about that, but we kind of have to, we're tackling like one section of the world of version control tools, or of what Git does for us at a time. And it's interesting at every point to be like, is there anything that AI can be good at, right? That otherwise seems like a slog. But that's what I find people find the most valuable, right? Is like, it can be cute or whatever. And there's some applications that you'll use it and it's like, wow, it's interesting. It can do this, but it's not really helping me that much, right? It's just kind of interesting. And there's other stuff that's super interesting. Like I really love how much less I have to dig through documentation sites with crappy search indices, when instead I can just ask ChatGPT, how would you do this, right? And a lot of time, or even just like I said, write the comment in the code and have Copilot be like, is it this, right? And it's like, close. That's very close, right? And it's kind of like what you said. It's not that I'm using the Git Butler AI commit message thing to write my commit message, but sometimes I'm just using it to remind myself what I did, right? Because it gives me a nice summary, and it's like, oh yeah, that is largely what but I'll put my own flavor into it, right? Or my own insight, right? But it kind of helps me not have to go through 50 diffs, right? And be like, what was I doing here?
Yeah, excited to see what else you guys do with AI in the future. But wrapping up the conversation here, we usually like to ask a future-facing question of our guest. And for you, I think the question is obvious. What do you think the future of version control is, and the future of sharing code?
Yeah, boy, that's a really great question. I don't even know if this is a good answer to this. My question actually about this that I'm most concerned about is where software development gets done in what time frame, because there are tools like Codespaces or Gitpod or something like that where there's kind of a bet in taking software development into the cloud, right, and having our laptops be thin clients, right, and we're all kind of, I don't have to have a $3,000 Mac or whatever to get stuff done. I can have a Chromebook, right? But like, I feel like that promise has been around for a while, and every time that I've tried to do it, even though I'm very excited about it, I've found it very, very frustrating and very difficult. And it depends on the type of software development that you're doing as well, right? And I think the proliferation of all of these technologies that people do use and love and stuff makes it even harder because it has to work well for sort of all of them, right? And so and we're building a desktop app. So we're kind of betting on people are still developing on the desktop, right? Like, it doesn't, if everybody moves to Codespaces, it's going to be a little bit difficult to move our tool set there. But I'm curious, right? Like, I feel like this has been a constant possibility. It's just been very difficult to do. And yeah, I'm fascinated with what the future of software development is going to be, and AI changes a lot of this as well, right? Like, is it going to get good enough where I can say, here's what I want, and it can write 100,000 versions of it and test all of them and give me the three that seem to work the best, right? Which is not what it does right now, but what it theoretically could do, right? It is very parallelizable. And or do we have different programming languages that are good at what AI is good at, right? Like, AI is writing software in frameworks and languages that were designed for human beings and have sort of the, like, it has all of the things that human beings are bad at designed into it, right? To kind of be better at. And so, and it's trained on that, and it can regurgitate that. But like, you could theoretically design a programming languages that was much better at what an LLM is good at producing and massively testing in parallel, right? Like, human beings can't do that, and so nothing's designed for that. So I'm, I think that we're in a really interesting space where none of us really have a good idea, and we kind of, year to year, month to month, kind of have to figure out what could be possible in a year or 5 years. But I think at the end of the day, what's really important about our jobs, about software development, is having taste in what the end user has, right? And so like I'm trying to make tools to make that process easier to get out of your brain and do. But just like you can build great software in React, even though I hate it. You can build great software in Svelte. You can build great software in Ruby, even though lots of people hate it, right? Like you can have these wars, but it doesn't. In the end of the day, Scala or whatever you choose, who gives a shit, right? What matters is this good? Does this solve somebody's problem? And so, I think like that, AI will be a good way of generating software, but you have to have a good idea, right? You have to have good taste on what that needs to do for people, for human beings, and I think that's going to be difficult to get out of the process, which is exciting to me.
The future is fuzzy, but we'll get there. So that wraps it up for our questions this episode. Thanks for coming on, Scott. This was a super interesting conversation about the history of Git and GitHub and what you're doing with Git Butler. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I really enjoy Git Butler a lot. It's been really fun to work with. I'm not using it as much right now because I'm just started startup with a friend of mine, and we're using submodules a ton, like more than I've ever used submodules. So when you have submodule support, you let me know, and I'll get back on the track.
We haven't started to tackle that. That's a beast. We just wrote in a thing. We got so many problems. We just wrote in a thing that's like, if you see Git modules, just stop working.
Yeah, I know, because it like suddenly didn't work for me anymore. I was like, wait, what happened? Anyway, yeah, but it's fantastic work. I'm really excited about the future of what you're doing there. I think it's very needed in the space. So thanks for working on it.
Can I plug something as well?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so we're, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, we're putting on a developer experience. So there's a lot of things I've been learning doing a new developer tools company, and so I've talked to a bunch of people that have been in the space a lot about, how do you do marketing now, right? And it's been 10 years since or how do you open source a project in a nice way, or engage the community or whatever, right? And so I decided it would be kind of fun. Like the Git Butler staff has been like, okay, I've been talking at all these conferences. So we decided to put on our own conference to just do this. So it's not like a Git Butler conference. It's just us organizing a bunch of interesting people that are doing stuff in the developer experience and developer tools world. And it's in Berlin in June 13th and 14th, I believe. And you can go to merge.berlin. If you are interested in coming or talking to me about any of this stuff, obviously I'll be there. It's going to be a super great time. So if you're in Europe and you want an excuse to go to Berlin, please come and join. And we have people from actually Adam Wiggins, who we talked about before, speaking at the conference, and a bunch of people from HashiCorp and from Microsoft and GitHub and everything. So yeah, it'll be a great time. Please join us. And that's my point.